Hello and welcome to Environmental Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today we're going to be talking about John Locke's Second Treatise on Government and his discussion of private property. The reason we do this is because we've been exploring the concept of anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is the idea of any ethical or moral evaluation of nature in which it's ultimately centered on human beings. And we're going to see this is the case for John Locke. And it's important because we'll see that John Locke, as the political philosopher who really sort of set the groundwork for much of the modern liberal order, also helps us understand why it is that we naturally seem to just view nature as a type of economic resources. So we're going to be diving into chapter 5 of property. We're going to be looking at sections 25 to 38, 43 to 45, and section 51 of Locke's Second Treatise. So once again, welcome to the video series on environmental ethics. What we need to do is we need to understand property and what John Locke's view is of private property, and that's how we can begin to understand where nature fits into the equation. Now, John Locke, of course, is a very famous social contractual theorist, so we want to give a little shout out to some others of the same tradition. Thomas Hobbes is another example. He's earlier, he actually is, maybe you might say, the first major modern social contractualist theorist, but we could also talk about others like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who actually coined the term social contract theory. Now, we're going to be focusing on John Locke in chapter 5 of the Second Treatise, where he really lays out how private property comes into being, and it comes into being first through natural resources. And this helps us understand what his view is regarding nature as ultimately being an economic resources. But we'll see that even though Locke is going to argue for the idea that nature, ultimately the environment, function as a means towards our end in terms of creating products and creating property, Locke doesn't think that that means it gives us the right to carte blanche, do anything we want with these natural resources. In fact, think of their very term, natural resources. This really highlights the perspective that John Locke is going to articulate. So let's think about what property is. The first thing we have to recognize is that there's a sort of common ownership of resources. Now, I shouldn't really use the term ownership here, because for John Locke, ownership is a sort of natural thing that comes into being, but ultimately we're talking about a sort of pre-political sense. There's this notion of the commons. According to Locke, the earth and all of its resources are initially held in common by humanity, and he understands this as a gift from God. Now, he's going to argue that, for instance, he doesn't doubt whether or not there's a God that exists. He's a Christian. So in his worldview, God has created the world, and that world, the earth and all of the things in it, have been created for human beings. So it's very much an anthropocentric vision of the world that really comes out of the Judeo-Christian ethos that's taking place. Now, again, I didn't really go over John Locke's dates. I have other videos on John Locke's political philosophy. You can take a look at those. But John Locke is, writing here in the 1600s. So it's quite a while back, if you will. But he's still a modern thinker. Now, John Locke argues that he, God, gave the world in common to all humankind, commanded man also to labor. God in his reason commanded him to subdue the earth, i.e. to improve it for the benefit of life. So Locke's view is that God created the world, it's ours to use and to subdue it, but we have to subdue it using our own labor. So labor is a very important thing to think about here, because for John Locke, labor is the mechanism of appropriation. So the way in which nature, the natural world, gets used is through the mixing of human labor into the natural world. And when we mix our labor with these natural materials, this naturally creates private property. And therefore it creates ownership, because if you go out and, you find, let's say you find a piece of wood and then you whittle that wood into some sort of figure, into some sort of sculpture, then naturally you've mixed your labor with the natural world. And who has the rights to that object that's been created? The answer is whoever created it, whoever used their labor to create it. And it's interestingly enough, because this view of private property goes all the way forward, even if we're going to talk about certain thinkers, like even Karl Marx, for instance, though it's more complicated for Karl Marx because he denies the universality and the naturalism of private property. But his same view is the same, which is labor mixes with the natural world, and this is what creates objects, and objects are what we call property. Here's a quote from the text here. Locke writes, "So that God, by commanding to subdue, gave authority so far to appropriate. After the condition of human life, which requires labor and materials to work on, necessarily introduced private possessions." So sorry, I see there's a little spelling error there, but this is where our possessions come from. They come from the natural world and our labor with it. Now, this means that there's actually technically, in a sort of pre-perfect political sense, there's actually no need for consent in appropriation. The idea that we need to use the natural world in order to live and to create these things, we don't have to ask people's permission to do it. Locke's view here is that the natural world exists, we go out in it, we take what we need accordingly, and when we modify these natural materials, we create private property. But we don't technically need consent in order to use these resources. And by consent, I mean the consent of other people. Now, John Locke's view is a social contractual view, which means that he thinks that the laws, in order for them to be just, have to be of the consent of the people through voting and mechanisms, democratic, republican mechanisms, and so forth. We're not going to go into that. But in Locke's not going to deny here that once you have a government in place, that your certain uses of the natural world will require a legal consent. That's not the argument. The argument here is sort of in a sort of philosophical sense, which is Locke asserts that the process of appropriation itself doesn't require consent from others. So when an individual gathers resources, those resources become theirs by virtue of their labor. And this is because it's ultimately what he calls is an original law of nature, namely that things created through our own labor should be ours. So labor is a mechanism for ownership. Labor serves as the essential mechanism for establishing property, because when you create something for you, it's yours. Now, ultimately, we know that you create maybe these products, but then you transfer them through money, and then things get more complicated. Now, this does mean that there is a moral justification for the use of nature through our labor investment. The principle of labor not only allows individuals to claim ownership, but also emphasizes the moral justification for these claims. So by engaging in productive activities such as the cultivation, improvement of land, farming, agriculture, individuals enhance the value of the resources, and this actually reinforces their entitlement to ownership based on labor invested. Now, we're really just talking at a sort of very general high level in terms of political philosophy. We're not going to deny here that there is complicated laws regarding property and the way in which property gets passed down from generations to generations, so on and so forth. But you get this idea that a farmer owns their land ultimately because they're the ones who are modifying it. So they've mixed their labor with it, and therefore they're entitled to it in a sort of natural sense. Now, there are limits on appropriation in Locke's philosophy. There are moral boundaries, we might say, on how property can be acquired. So one of the things that Locke introduces is what we might refer to as the enough as good condition, stating that appropriation is justified if it leaves sufficient resource for others to use. So in other words, Locke's view here is you can use the natural environment, these natural materials, but you can only use them so that there's enough for everyone else to use, and you can only use them enough so that they're still good to use for other people. So if you strip mine an entire mountain and such that no one else could ever use it, then that violates this condition. If you use all of the resources just for you and there's none left over for others, this would also violate the condition. So Locke doesn't think that our use of the natural world goes without any limitations whatsoever. He also establishes what we might call the spoilage limitation, in which he says that you're allowed to take as much as you need from nature, but if you take too much and it just spoils, and he's thinking of food in particular, if you collect all of the, let's say, for instance, if you go to a forest where there's a bunch of apple trees and other people want to use those apple trees, but you take so much that others can't use them, that would be wrong. But what if you take so much that you can't use them and they just go bad? This is wasteful, and this would violate the spoilage limitation. Same thing with meat. So you can think about, for instance, in the 19th century, when settlers were settling throughout the American landscape, and buffalo were just being hunted to extinction, to the point that they were just left, the carcasses of whole herds of buffalo were just left to rot on the prairie land. Locke would argue that this is morally wrong. Because ultimately you're just being wasteful with these resources and you're allowing them to spoil. So there are limitations. And again, we should mention that the things we're talking about here are really in a sort of money era. I'm thinking in terms of, we're not getting into the complications of money, how money would create certain sorts of limits on appropriation and boundaries, the moral boundaries of property rights changes when you introduce money into the equation. Because remember, the idea would be like, I mix my labor and then I trade the products I create from my labor. I trade them with someone else using money. Once I have money, now it changes the equation, because now it's not so much what I own in terms of private property is not simply what I mix with my labor, though it might be traced through it, I suppose. But I just want to sort of say here again that we're thinking at a very high level. Now, how can we apply some of these ideas of Locke's to think about the natural environment, since this is an environmental ethics course? Well, one, we can think about the transformation of wilderness, right? So Locke posits that the act of cultivating land transforms it from a natural state into a productive property. They're like taking natural land, tilling it, creating a farm out of it. So this is, in Locke's view, a sort of improvement on the natural world. And this improvement not only denotes ownership, but it also significantly enhances the land and the value that's derived from the land. So Locke is in general, his position is in general one where he thinks we should, and by saying he thinks this, let's say his philosophy would indicate that it is okay to transform wilderness into cultivated land, because it's understood as a necessary resource for human beings. And ultimately, he always understands the transformation of the natural world or the natural things in the world as a sort of improvement, right? So it's very positive in terms of this. So the transformation of wilderness would be one of the things that his position here would seem to advocate. Industrious labor increases value. So through industrious labor, the cultivation of land leads to increased productivity and greater yields than if the land were left untouched. So this principle establishes a moral justification for ownership and ultimately where the value of land comes from. And Locke's view tends to be this idea that the natural world itself doesn't really have value until we give it value, and we give it value by using it and creating it as forms of products that we can use. Now, what is unused land? Unused land is wasted land, therefore. So Locke contends that unused land is effectively wasted, and that by actively engaging in cultivations, individuals are actually fulfilling their duty, which was given to them by God, to improve the land, thereby claiming ownership. So Locke has a very old school way of seeing all of these things, and certainly, as you might say, a view which is definitely anthropocentric. And at the core of it is the transformative role of money in property ownership. So in his analysis, Locke will highlight that money does alter the landscape of property rights by enabling individuals to accumulate wealth without the constraints of spoilage, right? Because money doesn't spoil. So this accumulation can result in significant disparities in property ownership, though, as society begins to accept inequality as a norm due to this intrinsic value of money, or I would say instrumental value of money. So money is sort of interesting, and Locke will discuss it, though it's not central maybe to our discussion here today. What we really want to focus on is the way in which Locke's view underscores a type of anthropocentrism that links up the importance of nature as really being an economic storehouse. Nature is a resource for human benefit. Now, again, there are moral limits to this appropriation of nature. For instance, one of the things he does talk about is the protection of the commons, the notion that we do have to preserve these natural resources for everyone to be able to use them. And that means that the protection of the commons can be something that requires the consent of everyone. So that means that in Locke's view, if we're going to, so for instance, if we have a natural forest, or let's say we live in a nation where we have a forest and people want to use that forest, we have to preserve that forest enough. And the ways in which we decide to use it can be the consequence of how we agree with each other, how we make social laws, or how we make, not social laws, but political laws in order to govern the development of society. So consent is a part of it. So he acknowledges this view comes with moral implications, and he establishes limits on property appropriation to prevent overexploitation and ensures that everyone has access to these sufficient resources. Now, let's walk through some of the specifics of the text. In sections 25 through 27, we see that Locke will assert that while the earth is common to all, individuals can claim personal ownership of natural resources through their labor. And this establishes a sort of moral relationship with nature. In sections 27 through 31, Locke talks about this spoilage limitation we talked about earlier, positing that appropriation must be limited to what can be used before it spoils, emphasizing a sort of ethical standard of stewardship. And then in sections 32 to 36, Locke discusses the notion that cultivation transforms wilderness into productive property, suggesting that moral ownership is justified through the improvement and value that's generated from nature by human labor. In sections 37 to 38, Locke then discusses money, noting that there are moral implications to property change, as monetary wealth can lead to significant inequalities within society. And in sections 43 to 45 and 51, Locke really will conclude that labor is the cornerstone of property rights, which comes out of the natural world. And he emphasizes that ownership must serve the benefit of humanity, or at least with the community, and in order to improve things. So, what does all of this mean? How is this related to what we want to talk about? Well, number one, when we talk about sustainability today, notice that Locke's principle of property ownership, his principles of property ownership, actually challenge some of our modern practices, because our modern practices today, in terms of our use of the natural world, is clearly unsustainable, which means that the current levels of resource consumption would violate certain moral limits, the spoilage limit. So I asked this sort of question, taking from John Locke, we might ask, is an unsustainable society really a spoiled society? And I think his answer would be yes. Secondly, we can think about Locke's the implications of Locke's view on resource management ethics. This concept of to use nature just enough so that there's enough for everyone and it's good and it's still good for everyone might be vital for us thinking about resource management and emphasizing that the appropriation of the natural world shouldn't harm other people's rights to these resources. So we see within Locke's philosophy the germination of a sort of conservation of natural resources. But at the end of the day here, his view is anthropocentric, because at the core of what our moral relationship is to the natural world is ultimately one which is organized around what is best for human beings. And Locke specifically links this to his own religious tradition, or the religious Christian tradition of the Western world, where in Genesis, God gives nature to human beings in order to subdue. That's at least how Locke phrases it. So, and for us, we might say that we're living currently in the 21st century where the natural world is still treated as a natural resource. And it always will be, because in the sense that at least human beings need nature in order to live. But for us today, much of the Western world, in terms of how it is structured, treats the natural world as nothing other than a resource for human beings. And so this sort of notion that nature exists merely as an economic resource is a type of anthropocentrism we see in Locke, but we also see it in our own day today. Now, what else does this mean? It means that the social contract of John Locke is based on private property. Now, this video is really just focusing on Locke's discussion of land and things like this, but Locke's overall social contract theory forms the basis for our political system within almost any democratic nation in the world. So that means that baked within our very political system, our political philosophy, which governs us today, particularly in the United States, baked in that whole equation is an environmental anthropocentrism that sees nature as a resource. Because John Locke's social contract was based on the idea that once we have private property, we need the government to protect that private property. And that's why we consent to what the government does in order to protect our property, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, the whole thing is based on private property, and private property is a function of the appropriation of nature itself. So John Locke fundamentally argues that nature is a resource meant for human benefit, and that property rights arise through individual labor. So his principles, including the labor theory of property, the spoils limitation, and the enough and as good proviso, underscore that the moral responsibilities are all tied to our ownership, and so is the political system itself. So these ideas not only shape the modern views on property, but they invite lots of important discussions about what is ethical in terms of human use of nature as natural resources. So this is a sort of brief video just to give you a primer about the way in which our own political philosopher, John Locke here, articulates an anthropocentric view that really forms the basis of seeing, or it articulates a baseline for understanding why we tend to see nature as an economic resource today and as nothing else. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys online.